He is also a former policy advisor to the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade on human rights issues, and I am delighted that he could be with us today. Mr. Shahrooz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Adidal, for that very kind introduction, and to the ICC for being generous and inviting me to participate in today's event. I actually wanted to speak a little bit, not so much about the legal aspect of the sanctions regime, but more about the policy side of things. And what I wanted to work through, if time permits and if Adidal permits, two questions. The first being something of a normative question about what policy Canadian policymakers ought to adopt with respect to sanctions, and then look at the sanctions regime that's currently in place and to try to figure out whether or not we're meeting that ideal. And secondly, if there is in fact a gap between the policy as it ought to be and the policy as it is, then what can we do as a community to actually influence the Canadian government to move away from what things currently are and towards what things should be. Sanctions certainly are a very, very controversial topic. People get worked up about them, and understandably so. And I think the reason for that is because there's been such a diversity of experiences when sanctions have been used internationally. And I think opponents of sanctions typically look to some of the worst examples of it. I think the Iraq sanctions, for example, all of you remember that in the 90s. A sanctions regime that was put in place that really led to a humanitarian disaster. A sanctions regime that failed because it didn't do what it was intended to do. It didn't weaken the Iraqi government. All it did was it added an extra layer of misery to the lives of ordinary Iraqi people that were already suffering under a dictatorial regime. Simply then couldn't have access to medicine, couldn't have access to food, couldn't access international markets, and so on. But I think it's important not to overstate the case against sanctions at the same time. There are examples of times when sanctions have been used and they've been used effectively and they've worked. And in fact, I think we're actually in the midst of seeing something interesting play out in Burma, of all places. I think most of you know that Burma has been under sanctions for a number of years from the EU, from the United States, and from Canada. And the National League of Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi, a lot of Burmese activists that I've spoken with here in Canada actually believe that the sanctions have been effective, and the liberalization that we're seeing in Burma now can be in part attributed to those sanctions. Similarly, I think the case that everyone looks to as an example of sanctions working well is the South African example, where the sanctions, there was great divestment from South Africa. South African teams, for example, weren't permitted then to compete internationally. South Africa was kicked out of the Commonwealth and so on, and Canada actually took a lead in that regard. And again, the opposition inside South Africa was very much in favor of that. So I think there are two different sort of ways of looking at sanctions, and there have been different experiences with sanctions. And thinking about South Africa, I actually came across something interesting, an interesting quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where he said that tough sanctions and not constructive engagement finally brought the release of Nelson Mandela and the dawn of a new era in my country. This is the language that must be spoken with tyrants, because sadly it is the only language that they understand. Now, thinking about the question of what policy we ought to have with respect to Iran, let's start with the premise, and I think it's a correct premise, that the Iranian regime is precisely the kind of tyranny that Archbishop Desmond Tutu was talking about. It is, I've never minced words on this before, and I'm not going to mince words here in front of this crowd. The Iranian regime is a brutal tyranny. It is one that doesn't seem to respond to logic. It's one that doesn't really care about its own people's welfare. It's one that kills and tortures with impunity, and it exercises gender and religious apartheid. It consistently lies to the international community. And it's one that, to the, in the views of most reasonable people, is pursuing nuclear weapons. So with that premise, I think we ought to adopt the view that Iran's leaders should be punished in some way and sanctioned for their tyranny against the Iranian people and for their intransigence. But we have to add to that a premise: the notion that the Iranian people ought not to be harmed because of what their leaders are doing. And so I think that the fundamental principle that should guide Canadian policymakers has to be this: that any sanction that you adopt has to hurt the people that are responsible for the tyranny, but to the extent practicable, has to leave ordinary people alone. So the sanctions really ought to be directed at the Revolutionary Guards. It has to be directed at the intelligence industry, at the folks that are involved in violating human rights on a daily basis. But to the extent possible, it has to leave ordinary people alone, particularly vulnerable people. The elderly, pensioners, the people that are sick, students, new immigrants that are coming. The sanctions can't be so broadly designed, should not be so broadly designed as to harm those people. I think the second fundamental principle that should guide us is the fact that there has to be local on-the-ground support for any sanctions regime that you adopt. And that's the case of Burma and South Africa that I talked about. Whether or not Canadian sanctions have any support inside Iran, I frankly don't know, but I think that's an important question that policymakers ought to be looking at. And the other principle that we ought to be thinking about is the fact that sanctions can't really be the only tool in your policy toolbox. Your sanctions can't and should not cripple the population. In fact, the policy framework that you adopt should empower the people to fight back against those that are oppressing them. And so what I think Canadian policymakers ought to do is they ought to focus on the things that are important to Iranian people. I mean, the human rights file is far more important to Iranian people, I think, than the nuclear file. That's where our emphasis should be. Iranians want access to the world of information. They want access to media out there, and Canada should facilitate that. Iranian students with no ties to the regime want access to universities in the West. And I think our policy ought to be one that punishes the Iranian government, but at the same time allows people with no ties to the government to come and benefit from the universities in the West. So with that said, that general framework of how the policy should be designed, what have the results so far been of the sanction regime that's in place? Well, I think for the purposes of the panel, it would be great if I could say, it's been wonderful, or if I could take the very controversial other position to say that it's been an absolute disaster. The truth of the matter is, from where I'm standing, I think the results have been decidedly mixed. There are two pieces of legislation that impose sanctions on Iran. One is the United Nations Act, and the other is the Special Economic Measures Act. Both have portions that are very, very narrowly tailored, and they focus specifically on people that are involved in the nuclear program. And in that respect, I think the sanctions are fine. They don't really do any harm. They focus specifically on the people that they should focus on. But there is language that's problematic in the Special Economic Measures Act. There is language that prevents any kind of financial transaction with Iran by anyone, with a small carve-out of, I believe, $40,000 you're allowed to send for civil, non-commercial purposes, back and forth. And I think this makes life incredibly difficult, and needlessly so. So, for example, if you have property in Iran, it's incredibly difficult to sell it and send the money back, even if you have no ties to the Iranian government. And there's real confusion and real lack of clarity about what these rules are. About, for example, investors that want to come to Canada. And I'm very sensitive to the idea that our immigration system shouldn't be designed so that people that are in cahoots with the Iranian regime can simply come over here and bring their money here. But there's got to be a better way of designing the system so that you're not shutting the door to any Iranian investor that wants to come to this country. And I see a fundamental problem in a system that, a sanction system that operates alongside the US sanctions and the EU sanctions, and what it does is it harms ordinary immigrants with no ties to the government, and it harms students that can't get visas to come here, and it harms ordinary business people that can't do business with this country, but at the same time allows cronies, for example, of the Islamic Republic to come here with millions of dollars and buy homes in the bridle path. I think that's a fundamental problem with the system as it's been designed. The other problem I think that we have with the sanctions regime is that there is an absence of any sort of link with human rights violations. So Canada prides itself on annually leading a resolution at the United Nations General Assembly on the human rights situation in Iran. We have what is called a controlled engagement policy with Iran, where one of the few topics we're allowed to talk to Iran about is human rights. And we have Canadian citizens, Ali Assasi alluded to her, we had one Canadian citizen die, or be killed, frankly, in Iranian custody. We have other Iranian citizens and permanent residents languishing in Iranian prisons. And yet, despite all this, Canada, unlike the US, unlike the EU, does not actually have a policy in place that links sanctions to human rights violations. So ordinary people are harmed by the sanctions, whereas human rights violators are not particularly singled out. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. So the second question that I want to address is the fact that if there is a flaw in the sanction system, and I submit to you that there is, then what is it that we can do as a community to get the government to actually fix these problems? And I think that's a complicated question. I think there is an immediate answer to that question, but then there's also a longer-term strategy. The immediate answer, I think, is to have meetings precisely like this, to talk to our MPs, to talk to our MPPs, to write letters to journalists, and focus Ottawa's attention on the effects of the law, on the shortcomings in the law, and, you know...
1 minute.
Sure. And to indicate how the law is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. But I think what we also need is a longer-term strategy, because this issue, or this type of issue, is going to come up again and again. And I think what we need to do for that is to actually get politically active as a community. What we need to do is we need to join parties, work on campaigns, get to know politicians, and eventually, I think what we need to do is just be able to flex our muscle politically as a community, and to let politicians know that if they want our support, if they want our votes, if they want our money, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to consult with us on major issues like sanctions, and unfortunately they haven't done this. And they need to understand how the decisions are affecting us as a community here, and how they're affecting our families and friends back home. And I think this is precisely the right time for it. For different reasons, maybe noble reasons, maybe cynical, I don't want to get into it. This government that's currently in Ottawa cares an awful lot about the Iran issue. And this government, again, for either noble reasons or cynical reasons, cares an awful lot about what ethnic communities think. That's their electoral strategy, and we ought to use that as leverage. And so I close with that thought, that if you want to have a positive impact on the situation regarding sanctions, and if you want to have a positive impact for the community, if you want to have a positive impact regarding matters back in Iran, what you need to do is actually get politically active here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahrooz. Our next speaker, Mr. David Musavi.